In this tutorial, we will look at the poem Afternoons by Philip Larkin from the EDUQAS Poetry Anthology. We will look at it in detail, looking at some of the key themes that emerge from it, and also make reference to some of the key contextual factors as they arise in the text. Before we actually do that analysis, let's read through the poem together from the anthology. Afternoons by Philip Larkin. Summer is fading. The leaves fall in ones and twos from trees bordering the new recreation ground. In the hollows of afternoons, young mothers assemble at swing and sandpit, setting free their children. Behind them, at intervals, stand husbands in skilled trades, an estate full of washing, and the albums lettered Our Wedding lying near the television. Before them, the wind is ruining their courting places, that are still courting places, but the lovers are all in school. And their children, so intent on finding more unripe acorns, expect to be taken home. Their beauty has thickened. Something is pushing them to the side of their own lives. Philip Larkin was one of the most celebrated poets of the mid-20th century, and his poems have been described as a poetry of lowered sights and diminished expectations, and Afternoons certainly falls into that category. Let's have a look at stanza 1 then in depth and some of the key lines and quotations from that stanza. The poem begins with "Summer is fading." The opening line immediately sets a tone of despondency and gloom. The optimism associated with the fair weather of summer is diminishing, and the darkness and decay of autumn is now on its way. The fact that the leaves fall in ones and twos gives a sense that although autumn is not here yet, it is coming, heralded by the death of the leaves. The deaths of the leaves foreshadow the death of ambitions and expectations later in the poem. The title of the poem, Afternoons, also links with this idea. The afternoon, if you think about it, is the boundary between the light of the day, associated with hope and positive connotations, and the darkness of night, with its connotations of gloom, depression, even death. The afternoon is, if you like, the beginning of the death of the day. Larkin notes that the trees from which the leaves fall are on the border of the new recreation ground. Now, this is where some important understanding of context will help you identify and analyse some of the key themes. The context of Larkin's poetry is Britain in the 1950s, 1960s and 1970s, when towns and cities were still being extensively redeveloped, firstly to house an increasing population, and in some cases still being rebuilt after the devastation of the Second World War. This is also the time of new towns. In the northwest of England, for example, we have the towns of Skelmersdale and Kirby, both of which were built in the 50s and the 60s to house the growing population of the country. And linking with the theme of nature, which we'll touch on in a little while, these new towns, Kirby and Skelmersdale, and there are many of examples of those type of towns throughout the UK. Milton Keynes is another one. These towns would have been built on what would have been farmland, maybe over some smaller villages, but mainly we've got the idea of urbanisation invading and taking over what would have previously been rural countryside spaces. The architecture of this period was very modern, although it was considered ugly and very functional by many people. Many examples of this architecture can still be seen today. That quotation, that line, "the new recreation ground," can be interpreted in several ways. Firstly, it's an open space in an otherwise crowded town. It represents an escape from the claustrophobia of the urban streets and housing estates. It could, however, be interpreted negatively. It has been built in response to urban development which has destroyed the rural beauty of the countryside. The recreation ground is a poor substitute to the open fields of the countryside that once would have existed there. Larkin may be criticising the soulless modern development of the time. It is also only a temporary relief from urban living, as the town is nearby, and this is where the mothers and the children that are mentioned in the poem will return to once their playtime is over. We are told in this stanza that young mothers assemble in the hollows of afternoons. Hollows of afternoons reads as a metaphor for the empty lives and dull existence of the young mothers. Larkin offers a rather pessimistic view of motherhood here. He seems to be suggesting that once women become mothers, they lose their freedom and become caught up in the routine of looking after children. The fact that mothers are described as young suggests that they have their freedom and dreams taken from them at a young age, and that their own lives are now over, sacrificed to the burden of motherhood. In the park, the mothers are setting free their children. This suggests that the routine of modern living also causes children to be trapped at an early age. This is a useful comparison point to the poem London by William Blake in this anthology, in which he voices his concerns about the way in which the innocence of children was being corrupted by the influence of the Industrial Revolution. In the park in afternoons, the children are given temporary freedom from the demands of modern life, which may also include for them education and schooling. Moving on to the second stanza. We're told that the young mothers and their children are being supported by husbands in skilled trades. Larkin seems to be focusing on the idea of the desire for social mobility, this idea of wanting to better yourself and your future prospects by climbing the social ladder. The husbands, we're told here, have skilled, not unskilled trades, jobs that will have had higher salaries and would allow for a better standard of living. However, Larkin also seems to suggest that middle-class aspirations do not always bring freedom or a more exciting life. In fact, the idea of entrapment and being trapped in the routine of life is central to the understanding of this poem. Larkin also suggests that all of the women who are mentioned lead very similar, almost identical lives. For example, they all have the estate full of washing, which you could say is a reference to a stereotypical woman's role of the 1960s and 1970s. Remember, even as recently as the 1960s and 1970s, although that may seem like ancient history to you, women were often expected to fulfill typical gender roles. Notice it's the men who go out to work, it's the women who stay at home washing and picking up the children from school. There's no gender equality here. They all have the same types of photograph albums with "Our Wedding" as the title. Again, this is suggesting that women are expected to conform to the institution of marriage. Larkin also references the television, which to us a commonplace item in the household today. In the 1960s and the 1970s, if you owned a television, that would have been seen as a mark of how well you were doing socially, because you were able to afford such luxuries as a television. So again, it's tapping into that idea of social mobility and the idea of success through your job in the 60s and 70s. However, the poem questions whether or not the trappings of social improvement, like televisions, actually bring happiness and satisfaction. At the end of stanza 2, Larkin references the ruining of the courting places of the mothers and fathers, and he mentions them again at the beginning of the third stanza. Courting places will be a reference to the areas in the town where girls and boys would meet and date. Talking about going courting in the 21st century, that's an incredibly dated, it's almost archaic. Nobody really makes reference to going courting anymore. But in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, the idea of going courting would be the idea of going out on a date. For the young mothers and husbands, it's referencing a past which is now dead to them. Their courting days are well and truly over. We are told that the lovers are all in school, which suggests that the fun of courting and the fun of dating and the fun of falling in love is for teenagers. The suggestion is that marriage ends the fun and the desire for romance. Romance simply gives way to routine and a focus on day-to-day mundanity, such as washing the clothes and going to work. There is no time for romance anymore once you are an adult. The children in the recreation ground spend their time looking for unripe acorns. The acorn is often used as a metaphor for potential in the future. There is a saying, "From small acorns great oak trees grow." Larkin may be suggesting that for a child, the future seems bright and full of potential and excitement. However, as has been stated in previous stanzas, this is just an illusion. Larkin highlights that even at a young age, children have already developed a sense of routine and the entrapment of routine. We're told that the children expect to be taken home. They know what the routine is and are already conforming to it. The future potential represented by the acorns is simply illusory. Larkin seems to suggest that even though the mothers are young, the responsibilities of being a wife and mother have thickened their beauty. There is something ugly about this sort of life and lifestyle. There is another description that presents a less than optimistic view of domestic life and routine. Something is pushing them to the side of their own lives. This is the final line which concludes the poem. And remember, examiners really like you to focus on and analyse the final line, because this is often where the theme or themes of the poem come to their culmination and help to sum up the messages and the ideas that the poet is trying to communicate. Something is pushing them to the side of their own lives. Here it is clear that these young mothers no longer have their own desires and ambitions as their priorities in their lives. They are metaphorically on the sidelines. They have the needs of their children to put first, and they have husbands to look after. Their lives appear to be over before they have barely begun. The something suggests that the mothers have difficulty identifying what it is that has brought them to this situation. There is a sense of them asking, where did it all go wrong? Larkin presents these mothers, these women, as dissatisfied, disillusioned, and disappointed with the outcomes of their own lives. Is there anything structurally of significance in this poem? Well, I think it is appropriate that a poem that criticises the mundane routine and entrapment of modern life is written in a regular structure. Each stanza consists of 8 lines with no variation. It's almost like a physical representation on the page of a repetitive, mundane, boring existence. Just another contextual issue to raise. Some critics of Philip Larkin's poetry suggests that, and Afternoons is an example of this, that his poetry demonstrates what we call misogynistic attitudes towards women. A misogynistic attitude is a view of women that belittles or demeans women and women's role in society. Misogyny itself is the hatred of women. Now, what I would like you to do when you're evaluating this poem is think carefully about how Larkin portrays women in this poem. Is he being misogynistic? Do his views of women trapped in these stereotypical roles belittle or demean them? Or could we look at it more sympathetically? Is he simply presenting a reality that he would have observed in the context of the 1960s and 1970s? It's not my job to answer that question. I simply put forward there two considerations for you to weigh up and evaluate. When thinking about poems in this collection that you could compare afternoons to, there are others other than the one I'm going to suggest, but one of the first ones you should look at is that one I mentioned a little earlier, London by William Blake. And it's interesting, I think, to compare the ways in which Philip Larkin's Afternoons and William Blake's London communicate a sense of disillusionment and this disappointment and despair at the way life has turned out. So it would be worthwhile looking at those two poems and comparing themes and ideas and structure and language that are presented in both of them.